It's 2 o'clock. I see quite a number of people, so perhaps we can start the webinar. So my name is Winifred Seto Smith. I hope we have a good discussion through this topic. I think this topic is also very interesting for all of us to see as risk people and information security people and resilience people, to see how the COVID is affecting us through, and what other considerations we can make for a new normal. So we can dive straight into the presentation. I'll put off my camera so we can look at the screen. Okay, so I mean, basically, we all know that corporate governance is one of the main structures that all businesses use to perhaps give us principles by which our organizations can run by, and some rules. And these principles are also underpinned with key frameworks, processes, regulatory requirements, and guidelines for us to be able to manage our risks effectively. Now, if we look at the COVID pandemic, which otherwise seems to be just a health pandemic, it is a great test for corporate governance and how it has impacted us, given additional risks to areas where we wouldn't have considered thinking about a pandemic. So this webinar wants to basically look at how do we navigate all these issues, all these risks, look in consideration for a new normal, because we know that there seems to be no end to this for a while. So coronavirus is going to be with us for some time. So delving right in, just let's look at how our corporate governance structures work currently. And for every business, there is an agreed vision, what we want to do. And there's a mission and there's a strategy, and basically we put in place the goals. And once we do that, we also put in place our policies, our procedures, our processes to ensure that we can manage that from a risk perspective. We have our board that gives us the guidance and oversight. And the regulatory team also comes in to give us directives pertaining to the different areas that our business is focusing on. Then internally, we also have what we call internal controls to be able to manage our risks, to be able to see where the risks are. So if I'm looking at information security risk, for example, there are certain internal controls that will speak to people, that will speak to infrastructure, that will speak to process. If we're looking at business continuity, it will have other internal controls. And through this, we have principles by which corporate governance works, where there are lines of defense. So first line, where the people actually who are operational will have certain controls that they put in. Then second line will come to watch over their shoulder. Then we have audit coming through. And most of the frameworks we use are the international standard organization frameworks. ISO for risk management is 3100. For NIST, for information security, is ISO 27700. And then for business continuity is 22301, and many other controls, frameworks. So if we delve into business continuity framework and we look at the framework and how our frameworks are supposed to work, and trying to see how COVID is shaking some of the very controls that we have. So the business continuity basically is supposed to give us a good view of where the disruptions will happen and how basically we can ensure that we'll continue business. So on a typical business continuity framework and process, we will plan for how do we want to put in place this business continuity, what is the scope we're looking at. So if I'm a bank, I could say that my scope is around all the the different branches. I want to look at all my ATMs. How do I make sure that they're resilient enough, replicated across? I want to look at my database, where I collect all the, my clients, and how I can keep that data. Okay, so business continuity basically looks at the resilience and availability. So we put in all those processes. And through that, we also look at certain key elements. We put in a policy that gives that good view so that we can all manage what we're looking at and everybody understands what the mandate is. And then basically, we also budget for all those areas that we identify as critical. We look at all the analysis, identify critical processes where we can put in some redundancies, and therefore we go and get some budgets. And we put in place the resources and all that. And if we need a vendor to help us with those, in that view, we go ahead and do that. And another one is looking at the continuity strategies where you also want to plan for your people, succession plan. If somebody is out of business, who is going to take over? If somebody is sick, who's going to take over? And you try to put some kind of, succession plan. Maybe one person, you have like 2 people that you're looking at to take over at a point in time, depending on how critical, that particular work that person is doing. And on the geographical redundancies, you also want to see how widespread can redundancy be? Will it be locational? Will it be across regions? Will it be over countries and all that? And we also look at remote accesses and perhaps remote workplaces. So in a typical business continuity strategy, you would realize that as a business would say that if our primary building goes down, we will replicate, in another building. So we put in all the infrastructure and all that. And we put in our business continuity plans and basically put in contingency plans for known threats that will come every now and then. We go ahead and we train our staff, and occasionally we do a test to ensure that all the capabilities that we have implemented and put, in place are working as it's supposed to be, and it's fit for purpose. Then we have to make sure that in all this process, looking at our people, our process, our vendor and infrastructure, we're also aligning to the laws and regulations of the land, to make sure that we do not have issues with our regulator. And basically make sure we keep maintenance and then monitor as we go along and improve. So the cycle that we have it in business continuity is quite very defined, where we manage, basically we analyze, design, implement, and validate and embed all our processes. Now we'll talk about how COVID is, impacting that when we go further. So the next slide looks at our cyber security frameworks currently as we have it in most of our organizations. And I've chosen to zoom down on ISO because ISO gives a good view of the areas where corporate governance, put controls where information security is concerned. And so you see that in a typical information security, implementation, we would put, of course, information security policies on human security, on IT security, on access control, and then we put all those policies in place. We would have an organization of information security structure that will say perhaps we have, first line doing some work, the operational teams doing a certain, type of work. You have your risk team doing a certain work, and perhaps you have your third party, your audit teams also coming in to check over. And then we have our asset management, basically controls that looks at what are our critical processes, how are we making sure that, we are safeguarding the data on those critical processes. So we might underpin it with frameworks like NIST to give a view to say that if I identify a particular critical, asset, what are the controls I put around this to make sure that the data that's being transferred between, that asset to another location is encrypted through transit and all that. And, we have access control processes, physical, environment, put some controls to make sure that when people are coming in, we have biometrics and so on and so forth. Now, the key focus for information security is basically data confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And some of the things that, the information security teams will put in place ideally is to see how we can have security hardening for our software or our hardware. We do vulnerability assessments on our people to make sure that they are not the weakest link to our environment. We also have, some things we call security operating centers, where we constantly, analyze the threats that are coming in to make sure that we put in place the controls before they attack. Because sometimes when information security incidents happen, it might take a while, and, if it is something like a ransomware and critical data has been, hijacked, it becomes a key problem for the organization. And then we put in place contingency plans for known cyber threats. Most of the time, the keyword is known. We do the analysis and see what are the threats that constantly come around, a particular organization, be it a bank, a telco, or, or a hospital or an educational facility. What are those? And we put in place contingency plans. Then, as well, all the teams, we also put in place things like antivirus to make sure that we keep, all the wrong things from coming in, spams, phishing detection, so that the staff will not be phished, and, they've also been the weakest link. Password protection resets for teams, and basically also ensuring that we align with our laws and regulations. So in a typical cycle of information security, we basically constantly identify, we basically see how best we protect, we detect, respond, and recover. So this is a typical cycle that we have. Now, moving on to the COVID pandemic. Now, COVID is quite very interesting and peculiar, and actually the world has described it as unprecedented, and it's a word that everybody's saying because of its widespread of this disruption. Now, we all know that COVID is an infectious disease caused by, a new virus that, nobody knows, there's no cure and all that. And what it's important to know is that it's also transmitted from one person to other, and it's quite very lethal. It also can affect people's lives. People are actually dying out of this. And so that is it. And initially when the COVID pandemic came, you realize that there were, a global strategy to put certain things in place. Travels were banned across to make sure that they sort of make sure that the virus is contained. Supply chain was seized, almost instantly, and so on and so forth. So let's look basically on the key strategies that were deployed. Stay-at-home measures and social distancing measures to make sure that we have well-separated medical emergency procedures, travel ban across the world, schools and restaurants, almost in hotels, all banned. And what we realized in most corporate institutions were that they were forced to also put in certain measures, and some of which were quite knee-jerk. People were sent home. Some of the organizations that took the time to understand the process put in some health measures to see how they can contain the the virus. Also, putting in place some of the global directives and strategies, put in place work at home, measures to move some critical staff that don't need to be in the office to their homes to work, and then make sure that they also move along the critical assets. Now, what's key here is that in an organizational setting, we have all the infrastructure in a certain space, in a particular LAN or WAN where we can protect ourselves. Now, here's a case where the dynamics are changing quite quickly. So in this strategy, we realized that our processes, our corporate governance processes, our policies and our procedures are changing. Because where you don't have a policy to work at home, now you have been forced to instantly be working at home. The internal controls were also softened because of the mode of transmission. Where you have, physical access controls like biometrics, some of which were disabled to make sure that we do not constantly touch those to reinfect others. So if we look at the immediate corporate challenges that came, most boards want to understand the extent of what the problem is. Now, if you look at how the corporate business works, where you already put in a plan, now that plan has been disrupted almost immediately. People are sitting at home, people cannot interact with customers that often. If you don't have a strategy already in place to have digital systems that are working, then it means your business has come to a halt. So the board will want to see some numbers. How widespread is the problem? Management also wants to look at their plans vis-a-vis the already approved plans. Do we change the plan to plan B? What will be plan B? And where do we move from here? Organizations were laying off staff, and that was becoming a problem because staff that, also because they were forced to do that. Critical security activities, may become ineffective due to the staff shortages, because people, the organizations that were not, they were using this, they were, taking action because of knee-jerk and not thinking through the process as well. We're laying off staff before trying to see how best they can solve it. And also we realized that most organizations realized that the old security controls that they had in place were not effective anymore, because now your team is working in the house. Access control that you have on the PCs, you cannot enforce, because some staff may want to use their personal PCs to do work. How do we ensure that you make sure that staff are using their virtual private networks to access the systems within their home spaces? Monitoring and oversight responsibilities becoming, an immediate challenge. And then increased in security risks. So of course, the bad actors always want to leverage on things like this, where now the world is almost converged onto the internet, because everybody's working at home. People are on the internet constantly. So they will also capitalize on that to make sure that, they increase the cyber attacks. Key suppliers were, not accessible. So if I give examples where, there were country bans, the suppliers are working across regions and globally, it was becoming a challenge to access those suppliers. And as well, immense health and safety for organizations. So normally we know that health and safety focus for organizations working in factory settings, but now it almost all of a sudden, run through all types of organizations. So whether you're working in a bank, it became a major focus, because you could lose your team to COVID almost immediately. And also, we realized that certain, legislations were made by, some countries to make sure that this is being managed. So if you look at Ghana's case, for example, we had an executive instrument. If you look at other, countries, also had some laws to manage the global directive around social distancing, staying at home measures, schools at home, hospitals, workplaces at home, and all that. And what was also very interesting was that the normal process of business continuity, where we do a defined plan, do, check, became a challenge, where the contingency plans did not necessarily, the business continuity plans and the contingency plans did not necessarily fit this kind of COVID structure. Because in a typical business continuity plan, it's very clear, you have a clear view of which teams to recover to a particular a location. Now here's a case where everybody's working in their houses. How do we make sure that we are working accurately? And so almost immediately we realized that organizations realized that their plans were not fit for purpose, and that had to be relooked at. And employees' access levels doing work at home. Now you do not know, there's so much information and data that's out there, people sitting at home and having meetings and, you know, with families at home and all that. We don't know the level of security currently, and that's also a major concern for corporates. And the funny thing is that the teams are more fatigued working at home because of the environment that's happening. And basically oversight, also responsibility, is becoming a great challenge. And in most organizations where insurance is not, because now in most countries, I know in the European countries, life insurance may be mandatory, but in other countries, insurance covers have to be, you know, re-looked at to see how best you can give covers for, you know, staff around life covers and things like that. So immediate challenges were quite enormous from the beginning. So if we look at the COVID-19 considerations for new normal, I think it's very important that in our corporate governance structures, leadership decisions on what is important to focus on during this crisis is very important, because no one knows how long this crisis is going to be. If your business is focused a lot on physical, you know, interactions, you may want to consider a plan B game plan. Also looking at what the processes are within, looking at your business continuity processes, because a lot of the, you know, policies and procedures will change drastically because of the work at home measures. And some of the things that, you know, people are looking at is changing even the work flexibility and how that impacts on your information security, your business continuity, and basically the organizational risks. Decisions on succession planning have to be relooked and see how best those things can be shifted, you know, quite quickly. Normally in any organization, you would take a succession planner, you know, person, somebody who succeeds you in your area. Perhaps now you want to be looking at cross-functional teams to see, you know, sometimes your jobs overlay who else can be a successor in another area. They need to also reprioritize business strategy. In view of the fact that the economy took quite a big hit on this on a global stage, it's important that, you know, organizations look at how do we reprioritize our business strategy to make sure that we stay in business, to make sure that we continue business. Another key one is relooking the continuity strategies on a long to medium term. And so, you know, you want to look at the strategies currently that around your people, your processes, your infrastructure. Now, working at home, people are working at home, and the main infrastructure that's in place is sitting idle. Do we want to now use that as, excuse me, redundancies? And that also has to be looked at. And the other one that is also very important, because data is the bedrock of every organization, there's going to be increased security risks for remote working and learning. Data integrity issues, access control, phishing attempts will increase, and it's already on the rise. And employees may not comply with some of the company asset controls. And how do we as an organization and make sure that these are done? Discussions on budget reduction and how to reallocate budget basically also has to be a key focus and consideration for a new normal going forward. The supplier resilience measures also has to be looked at, because there's, in light of the COVID, there may be some suppliers that may have concentrated risks. How do we make sure that we spread our wings such that we can have, you know, alternatives within the suppliers, looking at your organization and what is key to you. The other bit is, also monitoring of human and physical assets is key. I think, how do we make sure that we are doing on more constant basis the human vulnerability assessments to make sure that we can close the gaps quite quickly? And all the assets that have been moved to work at home strategies, how do we make sure that we also constantly, ensure security and continuity to these assets? And the potential increase on possible delays in cyber attacks, because there's a lot of focus on COVID. It might take a while to realize some attacks in other areas, because let's not also forget that the attackers will capitalize on that and see how best they can also make their quick gains. And last but not the least, increased need for assurance currently. The risk teams, looking at how best to help management to see where the risks are, and how they can realign on policy with, management and the board to update those policies, how they can realign with the processes to make it a way of work, and then the procedures. And basically to ensure that there's compliance across, because there's going to be heavy reliance on compliance, where the requirements from legal and regulations have changed. There's going to be heavy reliance on compliance going forward. And also it's important that in all these considerations, we also have to think ahead of time, because it's very clear that this pandemic was something that the world had not envisaged. They didn't think that it would ever happen. And so we always constantly have to look at the fact that there are possibilities of black swans, things that never happen, but when they happen, they impact the world and the corporate environment so greatly. And so basically, these are the things that we should be looking at to ensure that we are managing our corporate environment. So yes, I would love to have any questions from here if there's any. You can write your questions on the chat box. Okay, so I've just had a question says, so with regards to recovery, any specific recovery strategy? So I think one that comes immediately to mind is, the key strategy, recovery strategy that we as business leaders were doing is to say that we were having redundancies across board and physical locations. And if you look at this kind of COVID where bans were made, where people could not even go travel across to certain locations and to look at those bans, I think that more and more people might be thinking about cloud recoveries. If you look at the fact that organizations had workplace recovery, actually a building in Wait fully set up for recoveries. Now with a pandemic and a disruption such as this, where people are working from home and the recovery actually is sitting in people's home, perhaps we may want to think about what is the approach even coming in when the staff is coming in. How do we make sure that we put in place a measure for certain level of staffs to have some kind of redundancies within perhaps their home? We need to think out, and that would depend on discussions from management and leadership as well. Okay, any more questions? Right, I have one question from Edward. Edward says that how can a company ensure itself regarding third-party supplier preparedness to assist it operate during the pandemic? Well, I think that, so what is also important is when you contract a third party, it's important that you have a very good view of their continuity strategies. And most of the time, this aspect of suppliership is overlooked because basically maybe the company will say, okay, I have two suppliers I can switch between. But what if that particular one supplier is giving you a critical service? You may want to also ask that supplier to put in place a redundancy. So I think from the inception of the contracts, we need to tighten the control around those kind of asks to say that we need to be sure that you can give us a continuity when something happens. But we also have to be mindful that there may be constraints. In the case of a pandemic like this, there must be some compromises that you can make with your supplier to see how best you can stay alive. The main thing is to keep your company going until you get to business as usual. There's another question that is here, says, and about assurance, any suggestions for how assurance officers can improve assurance as everyone is working from home? Yes, this one is quite a tough one. But I think that, so if you talk about assurance, basically I'll focus on second line assurance and then audits. So I think that that's why it's important now everybody's working at home. We need to be sure where we are focusing. I know in most organizations, when everybody went home, certain accesses were taken off so that the assurance functions that are checking will know exactly the areas to zoom on. But it's also important that assurance does not also look, especially the audit function, does not look at the way things are changing, does not only look at a time frame. We have to do a continuous monitoring to be sure that the gaps are closed almost immediately, instead of having a one-time audit over 6 months, or so on and so forth. From a risk function, since the risk function is basically helping the first line all the time, it's also important that they keep on giving that oversight on a daily basis to ensure that we can keep up the pace. There's another question from Frederick. Frederick is saying that, is there any document that can point us to that has mentioned some specific risks that I think he wants to say SMEs are prone to, and steps it can take to score itself? So I don't know exactly what SME you are involved in, but I think that the documents are all there. Basically, it would be good to know what SME you are involved in, so it's easy for me to give a view. But I think what's important is that you need to, as an SME, see what your already internal controls are, what you're doing now, and what has changed. And then you can see how best you can manage that. And there's another one says, Okay, it's the same question. Perhaps the SME one, we can see if maybe later, see how best we can share with you any document. But basically, I think we have all those documents and frameworks in the ISO documents that can give you a very good view of where to focus on. So I think my questions are done. All right. So I'll just wait a few more minutes, maybe 2 more minutes for questions, and then we can move on. Okay, so I think we can move on. Okay, so just to also say that Innovare, in partnership with MTN, will also be having the Risk Summit 2020 in Kempinski Hotel, Accra. The theme of the Risk Summit will be enhancing business opportunities through effective risk management. Also note that early birds group discounts are available. So we urge you all to come on board on this risk. The dates will be shared as long as once the times have been finalized. I think also dependent on the COVID, but somewhere in Q4, this summit will happen. So I urge you all to come. Last year's own was phenomenal. It was fantastic. There was a lot to learn from each other. And it's important that, you know, risk professionals share ideas constantly to be able to improve the environment and the, you know, organizations that we work in. So hope to see you all there. Thank you very much for listening in, and we'll call it a day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. That was insightful. Thank you very much.
Welcome.